Good morning. First, let's give John Clifton a hand. I didn't realize he was that witty, but he certainly is deserving of a hand. Second, he mentioned Don Clifton, his grandfather. Are you all familiar with the name Jim Clifton? So you know who Jim is, a hell of a guy, right? I'm going to mention him a few times in my talk today because it's impossible for me to talk about my strengths journey without talking about Jim's role in that journey. And so I met Jim Clifton about 20 years ago. He was the chairman of the board of the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, which is the trade association for state-funded historically black colleges and universities, or HBCUs. I was a new HBCU president at the time who happened to be on the board of the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, and that's how we met. Now, when it comes to strengths, Jim and I really don't have a lot in common. In fact, in our top 10 strengths, we only have 2 that we share. Jim's first strength, futuristic, is my 6th strength, which means that we see the future and are excited about what it can be. But when we talk about the future, Jim generally saw it in terms of maximizing profits. He's a great believer in American capitalism, and there's nothing wrong with that, and that's the future he always talked about, or at least that's the way I heard it. When I talked about the future, I was always talking about making the world a better place, which may or may not be the same thing, but I'm sure that's the way he heard it when I said it. We disagreed a lot. In fact, sometimes it was like we were talking 2 different languages, but at the end of the day, we kept showing up, we kept talking, and the conversation kept moving forward. Now, if you know Jim Clifton, the influencer, you know he could sell water to a drowning man. And early on, he sold me on strengths. My first presidency was at Jackson State University, and he convinced me that strengths was the way to go in terms of a business model for the organization. But back then, it was my first presidency. I was young. I was desperately trying to transform an institution that was politically vulnerable, resource constrained, and an HBCU in the state of Mississippi. And so, you can give Mississippi a hand if you like. I lived there for 10 years. And so, you know, it was hard for me to find the time to study strengths, to really understand it, and to convince my colleagues at the university that it was the way to go. And so strengths sort of went by the wayside in my first presidency. There were many fits and starts, but we never were able to really get it done. I ended up, and I have to confess, being a Stephen Covey 7 Habits trainer. And so we used that model to do the work at Jackson State, and actually it was good work. In fact, I thought at the time it was going to be my best work and my legacy in higher education. But that was 20 years ago. And I don't remember all 5 of my strengths, top strengths back then, but I remember the first one. I was a learner, which meant that I like to learn and I like to continuously improve myself and everything around me. And I learned a lot over 40 years as an educator. I learned a lot about our country. I learned a lot about education in our country. I learned a lot about the role of higher education and the students that higher education serves, but more specifically, I learned a lot about historically black universities and the students that they serve. Now, what I learned about our country was that this idea that we call America, which is supposed to be a land of many lands and people of many peoples, where all are created equal and have inalienable rights, it's still really a vision that has yet to be realized. Because if you assume that at birth talent is not distributed based on race and social status, then you have to wonder why, at the end of the day in America, 80% of the wealth is owned by 10% of the population. 80% of the wealth is owned by 10% of the population. But in addition, in that 10% of the population, 90% of that 10% is white. And so if talent at birth is not distributed based on race or social status, you have to ask yourself, how does America end up looking that way? Well, it's the way they designed the country. If you think about who the founding fathers were and the kind of system that they wanted to put in place as a business model for the nation, it makes perfect sense. But there are consequences to that type of business model. For one thing, it clogs up the talent pipeline at the top of the pipeline, which means that not everybody has the opportunity to achieve their highest levels of human potential. The other thing that happens, though, is that you have to suppress the talent of the people that you don't want to compete. And in that system that I've just mentioned, we suppress people's talents in a lot of different ways. High incarceration rates, low-wage jobs, high unemployment, food insecurities, healthcare insecurities, an education system that's supposed to take all of that and still be able to educate students that bring those things into the classroom. And so we have this structural so-called achievement gap in education. I call it a opportunity or a preparation gap. We also have every employer that I've talked to, at least in the Washington metropolitan area, being very concerned about where their workforce is going to come from and where the talent is going to come from when we've created a talent production system that actually suppresses more talent than it produces. And so in 2015, I got the call about being the president of the University of the District of Columbia. And I wasn't looking to be a president. I had done two. I was going to teach law at Southern Law School. And I looked at UDC, and it looked like a high-risk, low-return opportunity. Let me tell you a little bit about UDC for context. So in 1851, it was minor school for colored girls. In 1954, they merged it with Wilson School for white girls. That became DC Teachers College. The federal government in 1968 started a two-year school called Washington Technical Institute and a four-year school called Federal City College. And then when Washington, D.C. got home rule, because remember, D.C. is not a state, it's more like a federal territory, but when it got home rule in 1976, they basically smashed together D.C. Teachers College, Washington Technical Institute, and Federal City College and called it the University of the District of Columbia. And so when we got there, what we were looking at was, well, no, even before I got there, this is when I was trying to decide. We were looking at UDC called the University for Dumb Children, UDC. It had three cultures that were clashing and had never really been merged. It had a chronic bad press, a series of budget cuts and downsizings, and at the end of the day, it had 20 presidents and interim presidents over its first 40 years, which meant that it wasn't a very stable situation, if you can imagine trying to decide whether you want to take this job. But during the 20 years, being a learner, I actually better understood strengths. And I learned what it was about and what the philosophy was, and so I asked a different question. Instead of focusing on the challenges, I asked myself, well, what is right with the University of the District of Columbia? And just by asking that simple question, I came up with an entirely different perspective. What I saw was the public university, the only public university in the nation's capital. It was an entire system of higher learning that went from workforce certification all the way up through to PhD and law degrees. It is the only exclusively urban land-grant university in America, which is important because, remember, land-grant universities were founded to democratize education. And in addition, in the next 30 years or so, 80% of the world is going to be urban. So UDC was well positioned to help solve problems of large numbers of people in very small spaces. But then even more so, Congress in 2000 decided to designate UDC as a historically black university. And so what I saw was that it was an institution that by design and by circumstance was for the people, was for democracy, and was for the proposition that all are created equal. My first strength right now in the last assessment that I took was connectedness, which means that I believe that it's all linked together. Or some would say that it's all one and it's all God, right? And so that being my strength, when I looked at this institution that was for the people, for democracy, and for the proposition that all are created equal, where else could I go? So I decided to take on my third presidency at UDC. The first thing I did was look for a colleague that had left higher education and was working at Gallup. He was an education specialist at Gallup, and we reasoned that strengths, if part of a management and learning model, had a chance of helping to break the cycle of poverty and despair. And so we set about the business of establishing a student development and success unit that ended up doing really amazing work with the students that we served at the university. We had a core group of faculty, staff, and students who embraced. I became, and all of my leadership team became strengths coaches. And at the end of the day, I think that we did some really wonderful work. So, you know, the students that we serve, at least many of them, came to us with many challenges. They had for generations been told that something was wrong with them, that their future was uncertain if they had any future at all, that they were at risk, that it was their fault that they were at risk, and that their condition was their fault. And so we put strengths to work to try to help them see the world differently, but also help them see their place in the world differently. Now, here's some of the results that I think we can attribute, honestly, over the course of the last 8 years to the model that we put in place and the work that we did with these students. First, we only had 20 high-performing students from the public school system come to UDC when we started. Now we have about 260. The graduation rate when we started there was 15% for the bachelor's track program. Now it's 44%. Our law school just tied Yale for number 5 in the country, according to U.S. News and World Report, for the best clinical programs in America. Yeah, you can clap, don't you? We had our highest private gift ever in the history of the school and our highest corporate gift ever in the history of the school. AffordableSchools.net, which ranks schools based on quality and affordability, ranked our business school number 1 in the country and our mechanical engineering program number 1 in the country. But here's the pièce de résistance. Remember I said that we weren't an HBCU until 2000, and we had never been on the list of best HBCUs in America, best HBCUs in America, according to U.S. News and World Report. This year we came in at number 17 in the country, and also number 9 among public HBCUs. That's not bad for what used to be the University of Dumb Children. And so I've run out of time. Let me wrap it up. One of my other top 5 strengths is I'm a relator. And so I really have enjoyed the process of building relationships and forming teams to help our students do better and help our institution do better. And I've really enjoyed sharing that experience with you all here today. I'm going to be retiring at the end of June. And so this is probably my last talk as a president. And to be honest with you, I would not have even done this if Jim the influencer had taken no for an answer. But he wouldn't. I'll also be working, though, with an initiative at UDC called DAWN, Developing America's Workforce Nucleus, which is a community-to-career initiative to help rethink the talent production pipeline. We're retraining teachers. We're coming up with a game version of how to identify potential in students. And we're creating these seamless multi-credentialed pathways with multiple on and off ramps from middle school all the way up through to a bachelor's degree so that we can create a sustainable source of diverse domestic talent. Will it make the world better? I hope so, but I've learned a little bit over the years. I think it might even help you increase your profits along the way. UDC is going to become the nation's first strengths HBCU. We're doing the work now. And we're partnering with the Thurgood Marshall College Fund to pilot the work for other HBCUs who understand to help them understand how it works and what it can do. The other thing I should note, though, since I've had this journey with Jim Clifton, is that, he's also stepped down as CEO, but he started a center at Gallup called the Center for Black Voices. You should check it out. Now, will it increase profits? Maybe so, but it may also help the world become a better place along the way. And so here's the moral of the story. I'm going to keep hanging around, and I'm still going to be showing up. Jim Clifton's still going to be hanging around, and he's going to keep showing up, which takes me to the second strength that we have in common, which is command. It means that we have a presence and that we can get things done. And so if the influencer and the strategic thinker keep showing up and keep the conversation moving forward, as far as the future is concerned, I'm very hopeful. So remember, it's not about what's wrong, it's about what's right. And it's not about the weaknesses, it's about the strengths. And if you focus on the strengths and build your teams and your organizations around what's right, I guarantee you amazing things are in store for you. Enjoy the conference.